Hi everyone, this is Professor Tejada, and in this video we're going to read Chapter 6 of Frederick Douglass's Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And I'm going to show you a reading framework that you can use to read all of the articles for our class and all of the articles for any other class. It's called Talking to the Text. And it's really an annotating technique. We're looking for important ideas, unfamiliar words or important words, challenging passages, and a golden line. Golden line is the most important line, the one that resonated for you. So let's give this a try, reading Chapter 6. Oh, before I start, I did save the online article as a PDF, and I'm just using the free version of Adobe in order to take my notes. There are a lot of options for taking notes on the articles. I really do recommend that you do that, so when you go to write your discussion board posts or your musings, you're able to reference the text really easily. Okay, let's get started. My new mistress proved to be all she appeared when I first met her at the door, a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously to myself, and prior to her marriage she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. She was by trade a weaver, and by constant application to her business, she had been in a good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I think I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. Frederick Douglass is around 7 or 8 when he leaves the Lloyds and moves in with the Aulds, which we're learning about here in this chapter. And it shows us that he was so used to that dehumanizing behavior from white people that he is just so confused by why this woman is so kind to him. So it points to the conditions that he was in before, where he was never really cared for, often cold and hungry. And so for a white woman to be even looking at him straight in the face with delight is just really confusing for him at this point. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. I could not approach her as I was accustomed to approach other white ladies. My early instruction was all out of place. The crouching servility, usually so acceptable a quality in a slave, did not answer when manifested towards her. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it impudent or unmannerly for a slave to look at her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling better for not having seen her. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, and her voice of tranquil music. So I really like the way that Douglass uses language and metaphors here to really describe Mrs. Auld as this angelic figure. I think he really conveys his message quite clearly. So the stark difference between how he was treated and how this woman is treating him is really coming through. Let's keep going. But alas, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. I really like that line too. The fatal poison of irresponsible power. So here Douglass is saying that to have unwieldy power is poison or destructive, and that as soon as a person gains that uncontrollable power, they themselves begin to change into a mean, unkind person. That cheerful eye under the influence of slavery soon became red with rage. That voice, made all of sweet accord, changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Old, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. So here we're seeing that this is where Douglas learned to read. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Old found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Old to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. I think that's a powerful line. To use his own words further, he said, if you give a N an inch, he will take an L. A N should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best N in the world. That's such a powerful line also. If you teach that N, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. I think this is a really important part to note. We see that the power of learning is so destructive to the system of oppression that slave masters understand that. They know that if enslaved people would gain knowledge, learn how to read, learn how to think critically, that they could potentially start to question the system and give new meaning to the feelings that they're already experiencing within themselves. What's also interesting is that Mr. Old, the slave master, thinks that slaves are currently content and happy being ignorant, where that's not true. It's just that they don't have maybe the exact language in order to articulate that to other people in power. Okay, let's continue. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understand what had been to me the most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. So something has become apparent to him, and we're going to learn what that is in the next few sentences. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I least expected it, whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress. I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which, by the merest accident, I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. The very decided manner with which he spoke, and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction, served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. It gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results which, he said, would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, I most desired. So the slave master dreaded the fact that Douglas would be turned into an unmanageable slave, one that would be unhappy and discontent with his current situation, and one that would try to do something to get out of bondage. What he most loved, I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, to be carefully shunned, which is learning, was to me a great good, to be diligently sought, and the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read only served to inspire me with the desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to the bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. I acknowledge the benefit of both. So at 7 or 8 years old, Douglas realizes, wow, my master is so scared of my learning to read because it will make me unmanageable and a free person, free in the mind, that it has motivated him deeply to keep learning how to read, even though he won't have the help of the mistress anymore. So it really fueled his desire. He knew there was something really special about learning how to read. Okay, let's continue with this chapter. I had resided but a short time in Baltimore before I observed a marked difference in the treatment of slaves from that which I had witnessed in the country. A city slave is almost a free man compared with the slave on the plantation. He is much better fed and clothed, and enjoys privileges altogether unknown to the slave on the plantation. There is a vestige of decency, a sense of shame, that does much to curb and check those outbreaks of atrocious cruelty so commonly enacted upon the plantation. I'm going to highlight that. So here Douglas is comparing his time down south in a plantation to being in a house in the city of Baltimore, which is much more northern of a region. And he's saying that the proximity which you live to other people in the city could create shame amongst neighbors if you're not treating your slaves with some kindness or decency. Whereas on the plantation, you have miles, maybe 15 miles at the very least, before you reach another plantation. So it's much more isolated, and that means that white slaves and overseers have no one to answer to but themselves. And so that kind of isolation creates more cruelty for the slaves. He is a desperate slaveholder who will shock the humanity of his non-slaveholding neighbors with the cries of his lacerated slave. Few are willing to incur the odium attaching to the reputation of being a cruel master. I'm going to go ahead and actually circle odium. I know I've heard it before, but I need to look up that word later so I know its exact meaning. And above all things, it would not be known as not giving a slave enough to eat. Every city slaveholder is anxious to have it known of him that he feeds his slaves well, and it is due to them to say that most of them do give their slaves enough to eat. There are, however, some painful exceptions to this rule. Directly opposite to us on Philpott Street lived Mr. Thomas Hamilton. He owned 2 slaves. Their names were Henrietta and Mary. Henrietta was about 22 years of age. Mary was about 14. And all and of all the mangled and emaciated creatures I ever looked upon,